is smaller than a grain of rice. So at this time, one could not study it in any detail. Even if one was aborted, one would not know the difference from it, between it and the surrounding material. One would not be able to make such a precise sort of description of the human embryo. So the Quran's description of this seems to be way ahead of its time. One last thing, very quickly, before we end. One of the fascinating modern studies on the Quran is what students are now describing as al-Ijaz al-Amdi fi al-Quran al-Kareem, the numerical miracle in the Noble Quran. And this actually goes back to observations that were made, but very tiny, small observations that were made by some of the classical Muslim scholars, but they were not developed further because without computer equipment, without having the Quran as you know, with all of its features laid out before you in text that you can easily study. You know, when people just simply memorize the Quranic text, then there's not much you can do with the memorized text in terms of analyzing connections between parts. But when you have them written before you, and you can spread out the pages, and you can start making the connections, you can count things. This obviously is a modern phenomenon. Now, of course, we have computer systems with we can plug in the entire data of the Quran, and we can generate the results easily. But you can see that observations were made in the past by scholars, and they were not developed further. Some of the observations may not have been worth much, like Ibn Atiyah, for example, asking when is the night of Qadr. Laylatul Qadr could be anywhere between the odd nights of the last 10 nights, but most of the scholars believe it is the 27th night. And Ibn Atiyah says if we read the surah from the beginning, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatul qadr, we salamun hiya, and then he says hiya is the 27th word. So hiya, 27. If you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, hiya, 27. It is the 27th. You can see that this is a weak sort of inference, but nevertheless it shows a certain impetus to try and see if the placement of things in the Quran have any significance. In the Quran in Surah 74, we read alayha tis'ata ashar, over it are 19, meaning that over the hell, 19 angels are guarding. And Imam al-Razi rahimahullah has pointed out that the Quran starts with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which is composed of 19 letters. So he said that there's one letter here for each one of the angels who guards over the Jahannam. So there's a correspondence between things. There's a 19 there and a 19 here. Here 19 isn't mentioned, but we can see that there is a 19 if we look closely enough. But that sort of study did not go very far. But today, some students are taking it farther. There was a man in the United States of America known as Dr. Rashad Khalifa, who eventually claimed to be a prophet because he was so fascinated by his own discoveries, he convinced himself that he must have been a messenger of God to reveal this information to the world. Unfortunately, much of his information was actually concocted, and we can see that today. That it was a mixture between true observations about the Quran and also some fudged data, because he wanted everything in the Quran to come out as 19. And others can discover that for themselves, because you can plug the same data into similar computer systems and software, and you can generate the results and see where he has miscounted things, because he wants everything to come out as 19. And it's not necessary to have that come out like this, because you only need some indicators. You don't need the indicator everywhere. Like, let's say you turn one block and you see somebody there. You turn the other block, the same person is there. You turn the third block, he's there again. The fourth block, he's not there, but the fifth block, he's there again. So you get the idea this person is following you, even though you didn't see him at the fourth block. But your idea that he's following you doesn't require that you have to put him on the fourth block. Okay, he wasn't there, so big deal. But where he is, that is enough of an indication that he is following you. So, in a similar sense, when we look at the Quran, we see that the way in which things add up in the Quran, whether the counts of letters, the counts of words, the counts of chapters, the counts of verses, that we see that things add up in meaningful ways. There are things that add up in ways that are a multiple of 19, and I won't get into that now, but I'll go to some simpler examples. Let's look at what we find. For example, the counts of words. Certain words in the Quran occur in the Quran a number of times which are meaningful, especially in relation to each other. And we can see this, studying it for ourselves in a book, for example, in which this is detailed, entitled Scientific Miracles of the Glorious Quran by Muhammad Ali. That's a recommended reading. And for those who know the Arabic, one would check this book, Al-Mu'jam al-Mufakhris, the Alfaz al-Quran. So, this book was written in 1938 by Fuad Abdul Baqi, and that shows the recent nature of the studies we're looking at. Like to be able to count all of the words of the Quran and find out how many times each word occurs. In the Mu'jam, you can see that the words are arranged according to the triliteral root, and you can see at a glance how many times that words related to that root are mentioned in the Quran. And what is interesting as you do this is that you study, for example, the mention of Jesus in the Quran. We said in a lecture yesterday that he's mentioned 25 times in the Quran, right? And Adam is mentioned also 25 times in the Quran. And the Quran says, "Inna masal Isa inna Allahi kamathali Adam." The example of Jesus in the sight of God is like Adam. God created him from dust and then said to him, "Be," and he was. So the similarity is always spelled out in the Quran. That's the main point. Jesus is like Adam because God created Adam and God created Jesus. That's the Quranic perspective on that. But now we can see that there's another way in which Jesus is similar to Adam in the sight of God, because each one of them is mentioned by name in the Quran exactly 25 times. Now, how does that come about by coincidence? First of all, to make it come about by a plan means you have to be conscious of this, that you want this to happen, and you count the number of times you're mentioning it, and you make sure that the numbers are equal. And if you mention them together each time, every time you mention Adam, you also mention Jesus in the same breath, then you got it made. You don't have to remember anything, right? You just keep going. Every time you mention Adam, mention Jesus. Every time you mention Jesus, mention Adam. So you're fair and square. But when you realize that seldom do they get mentioned in the same chapter, most of the time they're mentioned in several separated chapters, then you can see how difficult the task is. Remember that the Quran was not written all at once. It was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a piece at a time, over a period of 23 years, commenting on various situations as they arise, giving instructions, answering questions as they are posed. And all of that now becomes a part of the Quranic revelation collected into the complete book. So this is not by anyone's plan that it comes out like this. If it were just this one instance, we would say this is just a coincidence. But let's see what else is available. The word for man and woman, for rajul in Arabic and imra'a in Arabic, occur exactly 24 times each. And people make the point that men and women are equal. Well, they get equal mention in the Quran as well. Shaitan and angel, Malaika and Shaitan, mentioned in the Quran an equal number of times, 68 times each. And this obviously is contrasted in our own minds. You know, the angel and devil seems to be on two opposite sides of the spectrum. Dunya and Akhirah, this life and the life hereafter, each mentioned 115 times. And of course, that again is a contrast to us. So the Quran creates this balance between the mention of this and that. And finally, we can see that the dry land, Bar or Yabis, is mentioned 13 times. And Bahr, which is usually contrasted in the Quran with dry land, is mentioned 32 times. And what's the relation between 13 and 32? 13 to 32 is the approximate ratio of land to water on the surface of our globe, since there is only 28% land, 72% water. So is all of this by coincidence, or is this a plan? And obviously it is a plan, but it was never a human plan, and we are obviously looking at the plan of whoever gave us this, and that has to be God. So if we continue, the word for month, shahar, is mentioned exactly 12 times in the Quran. And of course, there is a relationship between 12 and month. And it is interesting that the word for day in the singular yawm, without any suffixes, is mentioned in the Quran 365 times. Precisely. Some people ask me why not 354, and yes, that too would have been meaningful. But from the Quranic perspective, both the